we take a deep dive into the heated debate surrounding trigger warnings.
If you're in doubt of whether you should give a trigger warning or not, always do.
Trigger warnings.
Trigger warnings.
They know they don't work.
Romeo and Juliet. Did you know at the Globe Theater, it comes with a trigger warning?
Production contains suicide and violence. Well, spoiler alert. If you thought it was okay for companies to promote Mother's Day or Father's Day online, well, guess again. Chris discovered that could be triggering.
Look what Levi's sent customers ahead of Mother's Day. They acknowledged that Mother's Day could be triggering and gave customers the option to opt out of their promotions. Kay Jewelers did the same, adding Mother's Day can be a challenging time. Even DoorDash recognized the trigger and posted Mother's Day may be a difficult time for some.
That was a trigger warning.
Intense backlash surrounds the popular Netflix show 13 Reasons Why. The controversial series depicts teen suicide.
Well, please welcome Chris Gutierrez, senior news anchor for Merritt Street Media. Chris, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
It's a big problem because I think it's symptomatic of a mindset of coddling people and not preparing them for the next level of life. So what did you find out when you were digging into all this?
It's something that you've pointed out clearly. Part of getting through something is you don't tiptoe around an issue or a subject or a trauma, right? You get through that not by avoiding something. So when you avoid something, experts will tell you you're doing yourself a disservice because you never find yourself on the other side of that by ignoring what happened. Instead, you get that help through therapy and through counseling. It's like you go to the gym and you work out your body, right, Dr. Phil? At the same time, you want to work out your mind. You got to get things off of your mind so you can see the other side, you can get through it. You do that through counseling and through therapy, not by avoiding it or tiptoeing around it.
Well, of course. What stood out to you most during your investigation?
One thing I should point out is that when it comes to these trigger warnings, the experts will say that they're not specific enough in a general setting. The one that really stuck out to me is in London, Romeo and Juliet. Did you know at the Globe Theater, it comes with a trigger warning?
Yeah, and it's interesting what it says. I mean, let's take a look at this. Globe Theater, London. Upsetting Romeo and Juliet. Production contains suicide, violence, reference to drug use, gunshot sound effects, and stage blood. Provides helpline after show.
Romeo and Juliet.
Okay, so what it says here is production contains suicide and violence. Well, spoiler alert. In case you didn't know, somebody commits suicide in here, and this is about two people.
Right.
One of them's going to kill themselves.
You know, the more I think about it, as a dad, you talked about coddling, right? I let my kids fail, and it's hard, right? But what I'm doing, I hope, is I'm building resiliency within them, that they know they can pick themselves back up, and whatever that issues that they're dealing with doesn't define them. That's not who they are.
If you hover over your children, if you keep people from experiencing stress, strain, a degree of anxiety, they're never going to learn. And it's not just that trigger warnings don't work, which they don't. It's that trigger warnings have been shown to create the very anxiety, the very panic, the very things that they're trying to protect the person from.
Right.
And depending on what resources you look at, 50 to 75% of universities use these, and they have access to the same research that I have access to, which means they know they don't work. So why are they using them anyway? Because they're virtue signaling. And to me, that seems incredibly hypocritical to do something they know does not work, knows does not teach coping skills, knows does not prepare and toughen up the person for the next level of life.
Resiliency is what I'm trying to build in my kids.
Yeah,
personally.
well, you don't do that by not letting them ever scrape a knee, not ever letting them experience something that gives them some degree of upset. Thanks for doing that piece.
Got it.
We needed that.
Hi, Dr. Phil. This is Claire Ting, and today we're on the campus of Cornell University. It's clear that the debate about trigger warnings is far from over, so today we're going to get some thoughts from the students on campus.
The trigger warnings that people really care about: racial violence, slavery, pedophilia, mobbings and lynchings.
Domestic violence, sexual assault, relationship abuse, yelling. If someone's experienced that as a child, words of warning are helpful.
Teachers are able to still teach what they want to teach, just with a caveat of saying that this could be sensitive to others.
If you've gone through sexual assault, obviously you should get a heads up, because those mental emotions and feelings can absolutely manifest into physical symptoms and even hospitalization, which is something I don't think the older generation understands. We as Gen Z, we've prioritized mental health so much more.
We've been subject to trauma. The trigger warnings, this is more an act of love. A small thing we can do that eases pain for people in a very, very hurtful world.
Thank you so much.
Well, Claire, you think failure to give a content warning if there's something in a course that could be upsetting is actually negligent and unethical?
I think it's a lot more complicated than that. There is no one set definition of what a trigger warning is, right? The research that we have right now dates all the way back from 1985 to 2023. There's no one standard definition of what a trigger warning is. But in order for one to work, whatever form it might take, it takes two things. And that's mutual respect and radical self-responsibility. It's your responsibility to cope with your own trauma. It might not have been your fault that it happened, but it is your responsibility to take care of it.
What does that have to do with someone giving or not giving a trigger warning, whatever you define trigger warning to be?
Isn't the whole point of a trigger warning, right, that the content ahead might activate some trauma?
Well, I don't think there is a point to a trigger warning. That's my point. Because regardless of what you think, the research indicates that trigger warnings, however broadly you define them, are not effective. Look, I'm as sensitive and compassionate to people's reactions as I think you can be. It's what I do. And I don't want to create anyone unnecessary discomfort. What I want to do is prepare people to function better tomorrow than they did today. And if I create an environment where they can avoid learning to cope with what life is going to throw at them, then I am cheating them miserably.
Referencing back to some of the studies that you mentioned, many sources claim that trigger warnings don't work. A more accurate interpretation of that study would more so be that trigger warnings don't hurt.
Well, actually, they do.
Right, and that's because the study that indicates that they do, right? It says it's because of this anticipatory effect that a trigger warning causes. If you're a survivor of abuse, and I tell you, Dr. Phil, this movie might have some abuse scenes, it would be perfectly reasonable for you to have a temporary anxious effect. And that's the harm and the research references.
No, that's a very simplistic view. The point is that if you react to that and therefore avoid the content, then you're not learning to cope with it. Whereas if you continue to interact with it, you learn to be desensitized to it. You may even immerse yourself. In fact, there are evidence-based therapies that indicate that if you go through systematic desensitization, if you go through immersion therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, if you go through any manner of constant exposure to that which creates an autonomic response on your behalf, then that response will diminish and you will no longer be a prisoner to that. And when we have this list of content that gets so broad that literature itself becomes triggering, then that person becomes so siloed in life that they simply can't function because you're not going to get those warnings when you go into the real world.
We don't need trigger warnings in the classroom.
We ought to have trigger warnings for really any topic that might be depicting human suffering.
The results of having trigger warnings in the classrooms are students are becoming more fragile, have greater difficulty managing their emotions, and they're less skilled at navigating conflict
This generation of college students are anything but snowflakes. They are resilient.
Trigger warnings don't prepare students for some of the inevitable things. In the real world, you want people to be prepared to deal with difficulties effectively.
Trigger warnings do not shelter people from difficult ideas. It empowers people through having a conversation about how the best way to wrestle with those ideas so they can actually make a difference.
There is a problem with trigger warnings impeding free speech. Teachers and students are less likely to bring up difficult topics.
The idea that trigger warnings stifle speech is exactly wrong. A warning doesn't necessitate anything else other than inviting people to have a conversation. By inviting students to reach out to you to figure out how best to approach a topic, you're encouraging speech.
You don't need trigger warnings as an intervention to improve students' lives. They're a good short-term solution. You avoid, you hide, and you feel better. The problem is, by itself, it impedes your ability to handle this current stressor and future stressors.
Thanks for joining us. Todd, let me ask you first, where do you come down on this?
Well, I'm glad you guys are talking about the behavioral evidence, which I think is important. And the research is really clear. Trigger warnings don't really affect your emotions for whatever's gonna come next. It affects that anticipatory anxiety. But there's a missing piece that hasn't been discussed. When you get this anticipatory anxiety before you read a book, watch a play, watch a movie, you're so hyper-focused on your own symptoms and your own distress that you get to this problem, which is this. Our goal as educators or artists or anyone that's trying to deliver content is to build a sense of agency in people, build people's ability to tolerate distress so they can pursue the goals that are meaningful to them despite whatever emotions arise. What we don't want is a bunch of people that stop what they're doing because they're afraid to feel anxiety, they're afraid to get angry, they're afraid to be embarrassed, and so they don't take risks.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because whether it's the reaction to the warning of what's coming up or a reaction to the content when it comes up, and you have an uncomfortable reaction, why is that necessarily a bad thing? I'm glad you brought that up because whether it's the reaction to the warning of what's coming up or a reaction to the content when it comes up, and you have an uncomfortable reaction, why is that necessarily a bad thing?
Sometimes it's exactly what you want. So as you were talking about Romeo and Juliet before, the goal isn't to feel good and tranquil and excited. The goal is you're going through the arc of a very complicated emotional love story where the world isn't on their sides. And so what the artist, Shakespeare, and everyone who's interpreting Shakespeare is trying to do is get you to develop your emotional intelligence, improve your perspective taking through artistry.
I think you observe yourself deal with it, therefore make an attribution to yourself that, hey, I saw that, it wasn't pleasant, I dealt with that, and I can attribute to myself the ability to deal with that and get past it. What's your thought?
When there's sort of passive disclaimers you put on top of a syllabus, you put before something on a YouTube video or whatever, you sort of wash your hands to absolve yourself of liability. Using them too voluminously is like saying, you know, if you can drink 60 gallons of water and that will kill you, therefore we should just ban people from drinking water. Instead, if trigger warnings, when being an active opportunity to have a conversation with students, regardless of what the topic was, if they're not sure how to approach the topic, invite them to have a conversation with you, so that way you can help them work through it to the extent that it's something, in fact, where they can't do it alone. Because we're teaching on colleges, 23% of college students are food insecure, 25% of college-age women will experience sexual violence while in college, 8% of college students will be homeless at least one day during a month. And so inviting them to have that conversation can be an opportunity to connect them with resources on campus so they don't fall through the cracks. And in doing this for almost a decade, I've never once had to change anything that I've assigned.
I love the motivation behind this. To me, when I hear the evidence of you haven't had to change anything in 10 years because the conversations are present, tells me that maybe the conversations aren't happening. I would suggest an alternative. Set up in the beginning is, this is going to be the culture of our classroom or our workplace. And you provide rules of engagement or how we're going to have productive conflict, such that a student can talk to you about, you know what, I don't like the way you're talking about food insecurity. I feel as if your experience, your privilege is getting in the way from you understanding what my experience is. It's about not having ad hominems, which is, we're going to focus on the ideas, not the person. The idea that the only dangerous thing is the idea that there are dangerous questions you can ask, as long as it comes from a place of curiosity. And then you have the likability principle, which is when we have discussions with people, we tend to give a different standard for people that we like versus people that are on maybe the other political aisle for who we are. And then I have students discuss which principles are the hardest for you. They have conversations with me, and from that, any time that a conflict arises or doesn't arise, I can refer back to our culture is we're going to discuss all the things that are difficult in society because you come to college not to be people that look like you, not to be around people that think like you. You don't need to spend $50,000 a year unless you're going to be exposed to different ideas, different opinions. And so if we're not having conflict, we're not doing our job, and this class isn't working.
I am entirely in favor of what you're suggesting. I think a vigorous debate in the classroom is essential for learning. So let me give you an example. I've taught lessons on homelessness policy. We've gone through ethnographic kind of boots on the ground studies. I say, you know, here's what's coming up in our next class. If you're not sure how to approach it, like I would for any topic, right? Come talk to me after class, stop by office hours, send me an email. And so I had a student who says, you know, this topic's hit me a little close to home. I said, okay, and so we came to my office, said, tell me why. And so we're talking about it in terms, you know, they're actually dealing with homelessness themselves. And so because of that conversation, by inviting people to have a conversation, we're promoting speech, we're promoting the sharing of ideas and perspective. I was able to connect them with financial aid resources so that they got out of that circumstance. That lesson, after I talked to them at the end of the term, was their favorite. So something that otherwise they might have just tuned out of, they actually felt more encouraged, and by having that, I could build the one-on-one individual instruction with them so they succeeded.
Yeah. Now, Claire, you proposed a resolution to require faculty to provide trigger warnings about traumatic content that can be presented in class, including but not limited to sexual assault, domestic violence, self-harm, suicide, child abuse, racial hate crimes, transphobic violence, homophobic harassment, xenophobia, and other things, right? Mm-hmm. And what was the response?
We passed the resolution through the Student Assembly. It received a unanimous vote. It was sent to the administration, who then vetoed it on the grounds of it being a mandate.
Okay, so administration said no.
On the grounds that because we asked for a mandate, yes.
Okay. They said we can't accept the resolution as actions it recommends infringe on core commitment to academic freedom and freedom of inquiry.
So if we dive a little bit deeper into that administrator's response, we'll actually find that it was because of the mandate policy mechanism that would create a chilling effect. Although the authors of that response do acknowledge that there can be a form of courtesy and even compassion that can come from a trigger warning in the classroom, especially as it pertains to extreme topics like child abuse, sexual violence, domestic violence, etc.
Okay. What do you want to say?
So Claire and Connor, both of them are capturing this beautifully. What I'm suggesting is, based on evidence, there's a better way of doing this. As a clinical psychologist, I spent 4 years treating sexual assault survivors, most under the age of 11. And so I've had survivors that are with me where this is their triggers: green carpet, light bulbs, furniture that's unadorned. And so if you take all of the hundreds of thousands of people that are sexual assault survivors and made that the list in terms of what triggers are, it would just be biblical in terms of size. And so as opposed to trying to get at everything that can bother someone, miscarriages, abortion, race-related conversations that happen there, what I would suggest is you create a classroom that starts with a combination of compassion, personal agency, and I'm gonna treat you as if you are not fragile and you could handle difficult conversations. And if you need emotion regulation training, that will be the undercurrent of whatever subject we're talking about.
Yeah, because you can't identify the triggers. Even with PTSD, you can't know.